Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So our next two lectures are on the topic of conceptual design. And today, I'm going to tell you what conceptual design is, and in particular, what a concept is. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about design criteria for evaluating concepts. Now, I should warn you, that this material, on the one hand, it seems it might seem to you pretty vague and straightforward and even fluffy, but I assure you that this is important stuff, and doing it well is really quite tricky. So let me tell you how it ended up that I'm even teaching this topic in 6170. So one of the things I wondered about is, how do we help you become really great software designers? Right? So some things are pretty easy, right? How do you learn how to write code in Node or Express or MongoDB or SQL or whatever? And the short answer is, to get the basics, you just do a lot of it, and you've done a lot of that, right? But a very different question is, what if you want to really be a great software designer? How do you produce great software? What do you need to be able to do then? So in order to answer that question, I asked myself, first of all, what is great software? If I look at all the software products I know, and I try and separate out the ones that have some greatness about them, what is it that makes them great? And then I asked myself the question, how did the designers of those pieces of software actually do it? Because I want to be able to say to you, this is how they do it, this is what you should do. And I don't want to say you should apprentice yourself to a great designer and spend the next 20 years learning how to do it, because, understandably, you're impatient, you want to do it now. Okay? And the other thing that I asked myself, and it's a question that I always ask myself in every course I teach, is what can we teach you here at MIT in a lecture that you will not learn on the job, or that you will not learn quickly on the job? Right? That's why we don't teach you things like, all the details of Node, because we'd be wasting your time. Because you could go to a company and write code in Node, and you'd learn it yourself, right? And so it's very important that we give you real value added, that we teach you stuff that you're not going to get as soon as you go out into the workplace. So I believe that this stuff falls into that category, and that it's very important and very potent. Can I ask you, if you have your laptop open, if you could close it? Because it's quite difficult to learn anything with your laptop open. And also, I should tell you, it's actually quite difficult to talk to a crowd of people if a bunch of people have their laptop open. You'll have that experience sometime yourself, I'm sure. OK, so in short, the answer to this question that I came up with of how great designers design software and what makes great software is concepts. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So when I look at what are arguably great software products, so these are products that had huge influence. Now, we can have our nitpicks. We can say, well, Microsoft Word is not my favorite product, and I think that the Macintosh Finder was overrated, and I think Linux, Linux is far better, or whatever. You can say that. But these are hugely influential products, right? So we would like to understand, why were these products so influential, right? Why did Microsoft Word beat out all the competition? Why have pretty much all page design applications and word processors use the same ideas that Word had in it? Why is it that the Macintosh Finder came to dominate the whole idea of what a desktop should look like and how a desktop metaphor should be manipulated? Why is it that Photoshop essentially drove out all the competition, right? At one time, there were lots of photo editing programs. And basically, there aren't anymore, right? Photoshop is the only game in town. What did Photoshop do to make that happen? And similarly, what was the key to Facebook's success? Now, in all these cases, of course, there are other factors going on. There are economic factors, there are social factors, and so on. But I believe that what's really essential is that all of these products had core concepts that were really determinants of their success. And we can identify the core concepts in each of these products. So for example, for the Finder, the Macintosh Finder, I will claim that the two big ideas were the idea of a folder, organizing things in folders, and the idea of the trash. You might not think this because these are, you might not know this because these are old things, and this might seem obvious to you. In fact, most of these concepts probably seem obvious to you. But they were not obvious when they were invented. In fact, Microsoft had a major lawsuit with Apple over the trash and whether or not Apple's claim of intellectual property on the trash could prevent other companies from using it, because it was a huge deal in terms of the usability of the platform. In fact, in the end, Apple lost that battle, and it was allowed to keep the icon and to claim the intellectual property of the visual appearance, but not the underlying mechanism. Similarly, Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word has this idea of a paragraph. Now, you might think, well, that's obvious, right? That you can structure a document in paragraphs. Well, it wasn't obvious before Microsoft Word. And if you think about it, it's actually a pretty counterintuitive idea, right? Why would you imagine that a document like a book, which is a structured hierarchical document, right, with sections and pages and titles and subtitles, why would you think that it would be a good idea to structure it as just one long sequence of paragraphs, right? Well, the answer is because it actually turns out to be very close to what you want and incredibly simple and give you a lot of power. The designers of tech did not take that point of view, right? And they ended up with a little bit more power at a huge increase in complexity. And it's for that reason that much more powerful desktop publishing tools built on Word's model. They didn't build on text model, right? Because this idea of structuring the document around paragraphs turned out to be fantastically brilliant. The idea of style, which is the essential way that Word formats a document, that you attach things like heading to a paragraph, right? That idea, and then the related concept of style sheets as a way to maintain consistent styles, hugely influential. Now, Photoshop's a bit different. What's different about Photoshop is that if you don't know Photoshop well, right, you probably don't even know what the concepts are. Of course, you know that the main concept is the concept of a map of pixels, right, a two-dimensional array of pixels. Everybody knows that. But you might not know that the key concept in Photoshop is a combination, really, of two dovetailed concepts, the concept of a layer and the concept of a mask. If you don't understand those concepts, you can't use Photoshop. You can sort of go through some of the motions, but that is Photoshop. And in fact, those concepts are the ones that ended up killing all of Photoshop's competition, right? Those were the killer concepts for Photoshop. They didn't actually come out in the first version. They came out, I think, in version 3. But that was what put Photoshop ahead of all its competition. And finally, Facebook. Think about what Facebook is all about. Well, it's about status updates or posts, the friending concept, and the idea of liking or upvoting posts, right? There really isn't that much more to Facebook. I mean, there's tons of stuff, right? But these are the concepts that make Facebook work. Now, one question that you can ask, which I think is an interesting one that I've alluded to, is, when were these concepts actually invented? Where did they come from? Are any of these old concepts? So can you point to any of these concepts and say, yeah, that way pre-existed that particular software application? Can you think of anything, any one of these that came before? Yes. Are you Michael? Jonathan. He's Michael. OK. I'm getting the rough location. OK. Jonathan.
Well, I think MySpace did anything like that Facebook?
Absolutely. So the idea of particularly the friend relation was there in MySpace and Friendster. They really invented that idea. Now, as often happens with concepts, it's pretty interesting that actually Facebook changed that concept in a subtle but very important way. In those earlier social networking apps, the idea of the friend relation was that it gave you a path you could crawl through the network. I think actually even originally in Friendster and MySpace, you could see someone's friends, and then you could go and look at someone, and then you could see their friends, and so on. It was just like a sort of hypertext mechanism. It was basically a structuring of the social graph. And Facebook changes that and makes friending very different. It makes the friend relation basically an access control mechanism, right? That you can only see certain things if they're posted by your friends. Okay? And also a filtering mechanism, right? That you only see stuff by your friends. So that's right. What else here you might have seen before? I've forgotten your name. Michael. Absolutely. Michael is exactly right. The folder idea is what was called directory in Unix, right? And Apple's innovation in that case was the innovation of finding a nice graphical way to represent it, the direct manipulation design idea, right? In fact, many of these ideas came from earlier products. Style was invented at Xerox PARC. As we mentioned, friend comes from Friendster. Layer mask, I think, is actually original to Photoshop, so it was quite an achievement. So these are sort of these are the details of software products, where the detailed design of these products, where there's a combination of a couple of concepts at really quite a how should you say it, a design level that involves sort of serious understanding of how the user interface is operated and how someone interacts with it. This is where concepts come to play in most software designs. But concepts also come into play at a sort of a strategic level. So consider these products. So here are some super successful products. The iPod, okay? What was it that made the iPod work? Well, I think you can make a case that what made the iPod work was that Steve Jobs had a concept that nobody else had. And interestingly, this concept was completely obvious. It's just that nobody else saw it. And that concept, I claim, was the concept of a song. How so? At the time, everybody else was building things they called MP3 players, right? What did MP3 players do? They played files, right? MP3 files. What Steve Jobs understood was that people didn't want MP3 players. What they wanted was songs. And so he set about to consider basically the entire lifetime of a song. And he said, I'm going to sell you the song from beginning to end. I'm going to make a deal with the music companies so that you will buy the song from me. I'm going to help you download it to your computer, and then from there, download it to your iPod, and then you're going to play it on your iPod, right? A crucial thing was, up to that point, most music companies weren't selling songs, right? You're too young to remember this. You now think it's obvious that you go and buy songs. Well, when I was your age, people didn't buy songs. They bought albums or singles. And if a song was on an album, you had to buy the whole album. So Steve Jobs disaggregates the albums and says, no, I'm going to sell songs. Even if the songs are organized into albums, right, it's songs I'm going to sell. So here's something which was sort of obvious, but it wasn't obvious to anybody else. It was obvious to Steve Jobs. Here's another example, Uber. What is the big concept that Uber sells that sort of wasn't there before in taxi services? Again, something so obvious in a sense, it's staring you in the face. Ayush.
GPS-enabled ride-hailing, so you can directly from your...
Well, that's exactly right. So that's the technology. But in terms of what it provides to the end user, what is the key concept they're selling? Jonathan. Carpooling, yes, but carpooling is sort of the purpose. Here's what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of journey, right? Because if you think about it, what they could have done was they could have provided pickups, which is what taxis provide, right? You call a taxi and it picks you up, right? But Uber doesn't do that. Uber sells you the entire journey, right? You don't say, I want an Uber. You say, I want to get to this location. This is my journey that I want to take. And Uber quotes you on that journey and finds you a driver who wants to take you on that journey, right? So that whole journey concept is what made Uber. And likewise, what made Photoshop? As I argued, it was layers and masks that made Photoshop. Now, in each of these cases, as Ayush pointed out, you need some technology or some other stuff to make this happen. So just inventing the concept is often not enough. It can be really hard work to actually implement that concept. So in the case of the iPod, right, MP3 players at the time were actually pretty bad because they had no storage on them, so you could only store about 5 songs. And they had very, very slow ports. So even if you had storage for more songs, it would have taken you like an hour to upload any number of songs, like an album or something. So Steve Jobs had this brilliant idea that what they really needed to do was fix those 2 problems first. So he made a deal with Toshiba to sell Apple these new 5 gigabyte drives that were the size of a quarter. And that enabled them basically to say, we can store all your songs. And then they started their whole development of FireWire and things like that, these new connectivity ports that allowed really, really quick uploading to the device. In the case of Uber, it's true that there was lots of technology, but in some sense, they didn't need to make the technology. As Ayush said, it was GPS, it was maps, which Google had provided. So these were all pre-existing technologies. What they did was an extraordinary organizational effort, right? To get, by the end of 2014, which was, I think, just, a year or two into their operation, they had 160,000 drivers in the US, and they've basically increased that exponentially. So they realized they needed critical mass on the number of drivers, and that's what made that work. And in the case of Photoshop, it's pretty interesting. They didn't really need anything. The concept was just so good. it was really just implementing that concept. I mean, it helped, Moore's law helped, right? Because you do need a fast processor and a lot of memory to process images, but it was really just the idea was that good. Okay, one more example for you. What did Tim Berners-Lee invent? Well, of course, we all know he invented the World Wide Web, right? But what was the key concept? Well, let me ask you this. What was the concept that didn't really exist when Tim Berners-Lee conceived of the web? Yes, Michael. Well, yeah, in a sense, right? But the browser was a device, and there were things like browsers before. You could have things like FTP clients, which allowed you to download stuff from other places. The browser was different. But there was a concept that was underlying it that was different, underlined the whole notion of the World Wide Web. Yes, you raising your hand up there? What's your name? Bernard. Well, networks, yes, networks were critical. Again, this is the technology foundation, right? So these are all the elements. Are you Emily? Julia, sorry. Yeah, getting close, right. A universal space that can be accessed. Anyone else want to? This is a bit of a guessing game, I know. Well, I'll tell you what I have in mind. The URL. That was Tim Berners-Lee's big idea. Right? Now, you might again say, the URL? Isn't that a completely obvious notion? Well, it wasn't obvious before Tim Berners-Lee. Right? What was essential was you have a world of resources, and he said, I'm going to give names to them. Permanent names. Right? Names that everybody can use. Right? That was Tim Berners-Lee's idea. And then what he does is he basically makes the web by combining links, right, to URLs in documents that use this notion of markup. And links, and so I claim the web is really just these three things, right? It's linking, it's HTML documents and similar things, and it's URLs. But the linking part and the markup part, those pre-existed. People already knew how to do those. There was SGML and many markup languages that preceded HTML, and hypertext had been going on for about almost 50 years. There were many implementations of hypertext. You can read all about that, in Wikipedia online. So people had the idea of linked pages. They had the idea of markup. What they didn't have was this really fundamental idea that you could name a resource in a way that was independent of its location, right? Without knowing, the IP address of the machine, you could say, I want nytimes.com/date/article, and it will be a particular article by the New York Times, and it will stay that forever. So here's the idea of concepts, and the importance of concepts is something that goes back a long way. So how many of you have seen this book, The Mythical Man Month? So this is a classic book that, how many of you have taken 6033? Okay, that's interesting. So the Mythical Man Month used to be a reading in 6033. It's full of interesting ideas. It's written by a guy called Fred Brooks, who was in charge of one of the largest operating system developments, the IBM 360. And he has a lot of wisdom about basically how to run a large development project. But from my point of view, one of the most interesting things is that when he wrote that book and was trying to crystallize what the most important thing in designing any system was, he said it was conceptual integrity. And 20 years later, this book was such a huge hit. It sold millions of copies. He produced an anniversary edition, and he explained in the anniversary edition what he thought was a good idea and what wasn't such a good idea. And this one he said, I'm still convinced. Conceptual integrity is central to product quality. Now, the only snag is that Fred Brooks never really told us what concepts were or what conceptual integrity is. But a lot of people believe this idea that sort of getting the concepts right was what mattered. And he did actually, in a paper that's known as the No Silver Bullet paper, he did say a little bit more. Here's what he said. He said, the essence of a software entity is a construct of interlocking concepts. I believe the hard part is the specification, design, and testing of this conceptual construct, not the labor of representing it. What do you think he means by the labor of representing it? Yes, Kostas. He basically means the entire implementation, right? What he's saying is, yeah, it's important to do all that work with architecture and database schema design and everything, but that's not the hard stuff. The hard stuff is getting the concepts in place in the first place. And if you can get the concepts right, then everything else will just follow. And conversely, if you get the concepts wrong, there's sort of no recovering. You're basically hosed. Okay. So I became pretty fascinated by this, and this led me to a whole program of research and teaching to try and understand what exactly is a concept. How would you describe a concept? How would you know a concept if you met one in the street? And so basically, my program has had these elements. First of all, a theory of concepts, what a concept is and how you describe it. Secondly, design case studies, where we look at the concepts in a real design. Design patterns, where we say, well, here are a bunch of well-known concepts that can be reused. And then finally, we're building a code platform to allow you to assemble a system from concepts without having to write code. But you are no doubt asking, and I'll tell you a little bit more about these later, but you are no doubt asking the question, but what really is a concept, right? So I've sort of told you vaguely, and now I'm going to tell you in a little bit more detail what a concept actually is. So first of all, here are the sort of qualities of a concept. A concept is something that gets invented. The term concept is often used in philosophy to mean something like, the concept of a dog, right? The concept of a university, right? The concept of love. And these are interesting philosophical notions, but they're not invented, right? They're described, they're analyzed. But what we're talking here about when we say, the concept of layer mask in Photoshop is something that someone invented. Someone worked really hard on that concept. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that a concept has to be purposeful. You have to know why you're building it, what it's for. That turns out to be much more significant than you might imagine. A concept is a behavioral thing. So what I mean by that is it's not some kind of data model, right? A concept isn't what some people will call ontological, right? A concept isn't defined by its relationship to other things. It's defined essentially by how it behaves. And I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of that. A concept is self-contained, and it's reusable. So in particular, by saying it's inventive, I mean it's not just about modeling. By being purposeful, that typically means that a concept is a collection of actions that work together to solve a problem, not just one action. Behavioral means it's not something like an entity or an object. Self-contained means it's not something like an abstract data type, which is an encapsulated bunch of behaviors that can't be used by itself, that only works with other things. And reusable means it's not like what people call a feature, which is something that's layered on top of some underlying functionality. So let's look at an example. Our friend the trash, which is a pretty interesting concept. So here's the way we're going to describe a concept. We're going to describe every concept in 5 parts. The name of the concept, that's pretty easy. In this case, it's trash. The purpose of the concept, the structure of the concept, the actions that make up its behavior, and then what I'm going to call the operational principle. And you'll see what that is. So what is the purpose of the trash? So you've all seen the trash, right? Whether you use a Mac or not, the concept was so successful, it's gone everywhere, right? You see it in Gmail, you see it in Google Drive, you see it in pretty much anything. Any kind of interface involves collections of things that can be deleted. So what is the purpose of the trash concept? Yes, Megan. So Megan says to discard files. You're sort of right in the sense that, yes, indeed, that is what people do with the trash. But the concept of the trash actually produced a real innovation that allowed you to do something that couldn't be done with, say, RM in Unix. Jackson? Yes, get them back again. Right? The real purpose of the trash is to undo deletion. Right? That's what it's all about. Okay? How about the structure? Well, the structure is incredibly simple. You have some collection of things I've called all, they may be files or whatever, and then some subset that have been deleted, okay? That's all you need to know to understand the concept of trash. And then here are the actions. So I've defined 4 actions, and I've written them in this kind of informal notation, but what's important is that every one has one or both of a precondition and a postcondition, as you've seen in 6031, right? So the first one, new, says just give me a new object, right? Create a new file or a new folder or whatever it is. Delete says put it in the trash. So what does it require? It requires that the object you're deleting, X, is in the set of all objects, and it says add it to the deleted set. Restore requires that it be in the deleted set, and it takes it out of the deleted set. And then empty says, take all the deleted things out of all, so they're gone forever, and set the deleted set to be empty. Okay? So this is just making precise something you know already. Everyone with me? Who's with me? All right, great. So the last thing is the operational principle. And this is kind of an obvious but slightly subtle idea. And the idea is that to explain what the trash is and how it works, we're going to give essentially one archetypal scenario. So imagine you're trying to explain the trash to a friend, right? They've never seen it before. What would you say? So I claim you'd say something like this. If you delete some object X, and then you can then restore X, and you've undone the deletion, right? Or if you delete it and then empty it, it's gone, and you've got the storage back again, right? That's actually really two scenarios, and that's sometimes the case for an operational principle. But the point here is that I've given some very simple concrete scenarios. Now, they're actually slightly generalized, because I haven't told you what kind of thing you're deleting, right? But notice that I'm not explaining all the cases, and I'm not telling you what happens if you delete it, restore it, and then delete it again, right? So I'm not giving the full behavior. The full behavior is defined by the actions. I'm giving you a scenario that motivates the design, that motivates the purpose. It explains this is how you undo the deletion, right? Once you've deleted it, you can restore it. OK, so now what I'd like to do is I'd like to say a little bit more about each of these parts. So first of all, the purpose. So purpose is important because it helps you focus your design. If you don't know why you're building something, you're not going to build it well. Also, if you're building an app, right, and you have a whole load of concepts, like on your final project, you can have all these concepts you might want to include. The question of which to include is going to depend on A, how important they are, and B, how much effort they're going to be to build. So you really need to know why this thing is there. What's its purpose in order to determine whether it's actually worth the effort, right? So the interesting thing about purposes is that they're really often not that clear. Here is Quora explaining the purpose of user authentication in Quora. So I'm sure you've all seen this, right? You go to a Quora page, and it won't let you see it. And it puts up this friendly message saying, why do I need to sign in? Okay? So what it's essentially saying is, what is the purpose of user authentication in Quora? And here's the answer. Quora is a knowledge-sharing community that depends on everyone being able to pitch in when they know something. Right? So do we believe this? Do we believe this is the purpose? No. Of course not. What's the real purpose? Prevent spam. Perhaps the problem is that they do this when you want to read as well. Yes, up there.
My name's Nick. I worked at Quora last summer.
OK. They what?
They just want more users.
They want more users, exactly. They want your data, right? Of course they do. They're like everybody else. Yes?
One more thing. They're deleting the why I need to sign in.
Sorry, there's a?
Deleting the why do I need to sign in part.
They're thinking of deleting that?
I think they already did, but.
Oh, OK, cool. Well, one of the things I've discovered is you've got to get these screenshots. I'm writing a book about this stuff, and you've got to get these screenshots while they're still there. Because people do sometimes realize that things aren't quite what they seem. OK, so let me tell you about some typical mistakes you might make when you're writing purposes. This is perhaps the most common one. If I was trying to explain Facebook tagging, and I said, when you tag someone, it associates the image with them. What's wrong with that as a purpose? Jackson?
What do you get from associating?
Yeah, it doesn't tell you what you get from it. It just says what it does, right? So this is actually, you'd be surprised at how often, if you ask someone to explain something, they'll tell you this. But if you really want to understand how to use something, the first thing you need to know is, well, why should I want to do that, right? So why should I tag things in Facebook? So that's really a behavior and not a purpose. And actually, tagging gets to the interesting question that Nick raised, which is tagging really to your benefit or Facebook's benefit? Whose purpose is being served? That's an interesting issue. How about this one? What if I said that the purpose of an email thread is to let you have conversations with other people? What's wrong with that? Yeah, exactly. It's far too broad. You can have a conversation without conversations. You just send emails back and forth, right? This is a useless purpose, right? What do you need to say instead, Ayush? What kind of thing? What would you say is the purpose of the notion of a conversation or a thread?
For a thread, I believe it's to group similar conversations.
Exactly. It's to group them together so you can see a conversation in one place. So that sort of misses the key innovation. What if we said, talking about Dropbox, it improves business effectiveness? Adrian?
Yeah, it's too broad because like a lot of things can improve.
Exactly. So this, again, this is a good purpose. This isn't like the first one. This is the purpose of something. It's just not a motivating purpose for this concept. How about this one? For contacts on a phone, make it easier to initiate a call. So I think this one's pretty good, but it's not quite there. Yes, Costas? Well, I'm not sure. Maybe it's too specific. How would you want to make it more specific? That's true. It doesn't explain how it makes it. That's true. It doesn't really explain how. But in a sense, the rest of the concept might do that. Someone else. Yes, remind me your name? Pratik.
Well, a phone contact, you can email them, you can send them a message.
Yeah, you can do all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, the other thing is when you get a text or a phone call coming in, it will show their name if you've got a contact entry for them. So the whole notion of a contact is really all about introducing names for things that would otherwise be phone numbers, email addresses, endpoints, aggregating them, and so on, right? OK. There are some other purposes which are often misunderstood, sometimes intentionally. Sometimes the designers of these concepts want you to misunderstand them. So a lot of companies might tell you that the purpose of a loyalty card is because out of the goodness of their hearts, they want customers to save money, right? What is the real purpose of loyalty cards? Yes, Adrian?
To let people keep going to their place.
Yeah, to make people go to their place rather than another place, exactly. This is a more interesting one. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept, but this concept has been much in the news. At least it's always in the news every few months when someone pulls off a horrible scam based on this concept. So there is a legal notion, a concept of available funds. And what it basically says is that when you make a deposit into a bank account, the bank has to make those funds available to you after some number of days. And this was to prevent banks doing this mean thing of basically taking your deposit and saying, oh, you can't use the money for a month, and then basically investing the money and making interest on your money before you could use it, right? So the law requires banks to provide available funds. Unfortunately, that is the I've actually done this the wrong way around. That is the real purpose of available funds. However, a lot of people think that there's a different purpose. The purpose they imagine is they confuse that with another subtly related concept, the concept of a cleared transaction. And what they think available funds means is that when it says the funds are available, that means the money's yours. But as a lot of people have discovered to their cost, so don't let this ever happen to you, is that if somebody makes a deposit to your bank account, and the funds become available for you to spend, that doesn't mean that the deposit has been cleared, right? And if you then spend that money and the check bounces, right, or the wire transfer is found to be fraudulent, the money will disappear again, and you will owe the bank that money. So if you haven't heard about these scams, look up nanny scam. But there are lots of scams that work on the basis of this. In fact, a lot of the scams you get emailed about that say, I want to give you some money, I'm going to put some money in your account, and then, oops, I gave too much. Please send some of it back. And then the whole thing disappears. Rely on this. The notion of direct flight. Turns out that the concept of direct flight was introduced because in early flight reservation systems, direct flights were promoted to the top. And so in order to sell flights, airlines who were competing with each other invented this concept so that their flights would appear near the top of the list. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't know that that's the purpose of a direct flight. And consequently, they don't understand that a direct flight, A, can have a change in the middle, and B, can actually require a change of plane as well, which is very confusing. If you don't believe me, look it up. In fact, largely, the concept of a direct flight has been retired because it's so confusing, right? And now because people took it to mean non-stop. So there's a concept of a non-stop flight. A non-stop flight is what a lot of people thought they were getting with a direct flight, but they weren't. OK. Finally, let's see. Well, not finally, almost finally, structure and actions. Why do they matter? Because essentially, they describe the whole behavior. So, for example, if I wanted to describe Facebook tagging, I can describe it in this very simple way. I can say, I've got this structure, right, which says there are users with friends, and users have posts that they author, and posts can have tags, which are sets of other users. And then I can describe the tagging action by saying the tagging action has an actor, that's the user who actually does the tagging, P, the post that actually gets tagged, and then some user that's going to be associated with that post, okay? And maybe I'll require that the actor be the author of the post. I think Facebook doesn't necessarily require that, actually. And I might require that the user be one of the friends of the actor. And then the effect is that the tags associated with that post now include you, okay? Now, the important thing, when you do these kinds of things, this actually can help you resolve something that might have been bothering you about data models, which is, well, some of you have asked me, how far do I go? Like, do I need, for example, to have a string name for the user? Or is it enough to have just a notion of a user, an abstract notion of a user? And one way to check that is to see what you actually need in your actions. And in this case, it's very clear from the action and the fact that it's OK to tag a user you rather than provide the name of the user, that this is OK. Now, of course, you then need to be able to implement that, right? And the way this is implemented in Facebook is Facebook has this mechanism whereby you start typing a name, and then it gives you a list of users. And you can point to the user and say, that's the user that I mean. Okay? So there are really two concepts working together there, a kind of user selection concept and then the tagging concept. The tagging concept doesn't require anything to do with the names of users. And then finally, the operational principle. So, you know, the most common mistake with an operational principle is not showing how it fulfills the purpose. So if you said that the purpose of the trash was, that the operational principle of the trash was, well, you just move things there to delete them, that wouldn't get the idea of undoing deletions. Now, here's a much more subtle problem with operational principles that I want you to think about. How many of you have used SSH keys and know about the known host file? OK, quite a lot of you. So if I wanted to write an operational principle for the concept of known host, right, it would certainly have to include the fact that when you open a connection to a server, it checks whether that SSH key is the one you're expecting, right? But this operational principle does not have what I call a large enough span, meaning that it doesn't tell you the whole story, right? The most important part of this story is that at some point in the past, you connected with this server and you believed the SSH key it gave you, right? All this security mechanism does is check that whatever SSH key you're getting now is the one you got before, right? That's what known host is. And so if someone pulls off some kind of attack on you, right, and you know, athena.mit.edu suddenly changes because there's some person in the middle attack, right, putting another machine in there, you'll know because you'll say, wait, that's not the SSH key I'm used to, right? That's not the old one. But if someone can fool you the very first time, then of course they've got you, right? So the point is that the operational principle here has to start with the very first time you connect. You say you get an SSH key the first time you connect. And you have to do some job to decide whether you're going to believe it that time. You might say, well, I'm just going to hope for the best. That's what I usually do. I'm not going to do some independent check. I'll just assume I'm not being attacked right now. Okay? And then later it will check against that key. Okay. Okay, so here's what we're going to do now. We're going to do an exercise. And I want you to sketch the elements of the concept of short URL, OK? And I want you to do this in a way that's thoughtful but very lightweight. So just to give you some idea, what I'm expecting for the structure is that you just have like one or two sets and one or two relations maximum, OK? So you can write this down in text if you like, and there's an option to do that. So the YEL key is evening. And I want you to just think about each of these things. Again, for the actions, don't list the behavior of the actions. Just write out their signatures, the name of the action, right? There are only a couple of them, 2 or 3, 1 or 2 or 3, right? And you can do this with the person next to you, but I'd like you then to just submit individually. So before actually we talk about this, I want to give you another example of an operational principle to address Darius's question, which is, given that I think what's implicit in his question is, given that you've got these actions, why do you need an operational principle? Okay? So I'm going to explain something to you and show you that the most compelling way to explain it is with an operational principle. So how many of you are familiar with the notion of styles in word processors like Microsoft Word? OK, so here's how I would explain styles to someone. I would say, first of all, I tell them what the purpose is. The purpose of styles is to make it easy to format a document in a consistent way. OK? That's the purpose. Then I would explain the structure, the data model. And I'd say, here's the idea. You've got a collection of paragraphs, and you've got a collection of styles that have these properties, like bold, underline, 12-point. And there's this fixed collection of styles, and these styles are associated with the paragraphs. So I know that this paragraph is heading 1, and this paragraph is heading 2. OK? So there's the structure. And then I give you the actions. So the actions are you can create a style, you can modify a style, you can attach a style to a paragraph. OK? There are others, but that's the basic idea. Now, if you didn't know what styles were, I claim you wouldn't really understand at that point what styles really are, like how they really work, or what, why you would want such a thing. So now I'm going to try and explain to you why you would want such a thing, right? So the reason you'd want such a thing is that if you created a document and you attach styles to all the different paragraphs, so let's say I create a paragraph and I call it heading 1. I create a second paragraph and I call it heading 1 also. And then I now decide that I want all my headings not to be bold but to be italic. Well, all I need to do is go to heading 1, change heading 1 from bold to italic, and both of the heading paragraphs will change in concert with one another. So essentially, I can get every heading in the document to change just by changing the style. So do you now understand that in giving you that, which was an operational principle, I actually gave you a rather weird and elaborate scenario. I gave you a scenario in which you attached a style to 2 different paragraphs, and then you updated that style. And what I'm claiming is that if I didn't give you that complicated scenario, you really wouldn't understand what a style was. In particular, I could have given you this scenario instead. I could have said, here's what a style is. When you want to make something look like a heading, you go to the selection of styles, and you click on heading 1, and it makes it like a heading. That, indeed, is the way a lot of people use styles, but that's missing out on most of their power. And in fact, there are many tools that have that kind of style, but it's a kind of pseudo-style. But they don't have the real style that maintains this link and allows you to change the style later and change everything that's associated with it. OK? So this is the rationale for the operational principle. Does that make sense? All right, so let's talk about the short URL concept. What did you come up with? What's the purpose of the short URL concept? Jonathan.
To allow people to easily remember and share URLs.
Exactly, to make it easier to remember and share URLs. Did anyone come up with a different kind of purpose? Interesting. Yes, Michael.
To have users create and own shorter URL addresses.
Yeah, this is interesting. So the question is, I think you're right, there's something else is going on when you can own your own portfolio of short names. But that doesn't get to the purpose of why you would want to do that. But I think you're right, there's something else there. What might you want to do? What purpose would that serve if you could do that?
You could be the one to edit or share it.
You could be, but I think you could do something else as well, right? So one thing you could do is that if I want to know, for example, let's say I have this nifty website about conceptual design, and I want to know who's going to my website, right? Then I could create 3 different short URLs. I could give one to you, I could give one in a research audience, I could give one to my friends. And then what I could do is I could use the tracking in the URL shortener to see which of those 3 URLs got the most hits. So I would essentially be adding a layer of tracking above the analytics I could get from my website, because I would know essentially which audiences were accessing that URL by giving different URLs to different audiences. Right? So that's one thing that people do when they create portfolios of short URLs. So this is an interesting question, whether or not there are multiple purposes. So indeed, being more memorable is the first one that comes to mind. Oh, and enabling tracking is one I just suggested. A third possible one is, what about hiding secrets, right? So you've probably noticed that a lot of phishing emails use short URLs because it allows them to obscure. They're sending you to, you know, myevilcomputer.in.nigeria.com or wherever, right? We shouldn't be unfair about Nigeria, myevilcomputer.in.Massachusetts.com or whatever, right? But whatever it isn't Google or PayPal or Netflix that you were expecting, right? So you can use a short URL as a kind of obfuscation. Now, of course, it's not really so good for these other things, right? So what we're going to see when we talk more about purposes is that you really want a concept to be really focused on one purpose. How about the structure? Well, you all got something like this, right? You've just got an association between strings and URLs. So one thing you might ask is, well, why wouldn't you include all that stuff we had about owners, right? Remember that when we designed the URL shortener, we had owners, right? And we allowed owners to own URLs. Well, one reason is that when we think about concepts, it's very nice to be able to divide things up into separable concepts. So I could say, well, I am going to have that in my application, but I'm going to have an ownership concept, like an authentication concept, which will give owners access and control of certain kinds of assets. And maybe URLs, in this case, will be one of them, short URLs, OK? So I can get a kind of separation of concerns and say it's not essential to the notion of a short URL to have an owner. That's like a separate notion that often gets put in the service. What actions did you come up with? What are the actions for a short URL concept? Yes, Megan. Creating one and accessing it, exactly. So I don't really know how to write that, but in order to sort of show that the access has to really be a GET, an HTTP GET, to make it useful, I sort of wrote it in sort of pseudo express syntax, right? So it basically says that the effect is to actually get the expanded URL. That's the transparency that you want. And then the operational principle, of course, is one person typically creates the short URL and gives it to another, right? I mean, you could create them for yourself, but that's not typically how they're used. OK, any questions about this? Yes. Remind me of your name. Julia, I'm sorry.
For structure, when you mean by URL, are you referring to the short URL?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the long URL. Yeah, that's really... oh, and the reason, no, actually, I was going to say that's bad, but it's not so bad because the string that I'm saving is typically not a full URL. It's the bit that gets concatenated on the end, right? And then that's going to be translated into a full URL. OK? And of course, you can stuff. One of the things that some of these URL shortener services will let you do is stuff a whole load of query parameters on as well. I don't know if you've seen that, but you can add these things called UTM tags that allow you to actually pass on the analytics from the short URL to the website itself, so that you can use Google Analytics on your website to figure out where the traffic's coming from. Other questions about this? OK. Who feels this is sort of making sense? OK. I'd like to now talk about what goes wrong. So you're designing a concept, and it just doesn't work quite right. So I'd like to give you an example of something that can go wrong in actually a very good concept. So we're going to go back to our friend, the Macintosh trash. And it has some pretty interesting misfits, and I want to show you one of them. A misfit is a case in which the concept doesn't fit the purpose. If you could close your laptops, that would be great. So I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but when the trash meets an external drive, sad things happen. So let me show you some of the sad things that happen. So let's suppose I have this slide deck, right? And I want to share it with a friend. And that friend has a USB key. And they plug the USB key in. And the USB key has some photos in it, OK? So I do a move in the Finder from the, and that's going to do a copy, right? When you move to an external drive. And it says the following. The item concept slides can't be copied because it isn't enough free space. OK? So I'm a naive user of the Finder. So what do? I go and I say, no problem. I'll delete the contents of the USB key. So I select that, and I delete, and now it looks like that. OK? And now I try and move again, and what does it say? Does it let me do it? No. it says, can't be copied because there isn't enough free space. What's going on? Well, what's going on is that before I deleted it, I had one item on my USB key, and I had less than a megabyte available storage. And after I deleted it, I had nothing on the key, and I still have less than a megabyte available. How did this happen? Yes, Darius. Yes. The problem is, all I did was move it into the trash. And as we said, the way the trash concept works is you don't reclaim the storage until you empty the trash. And so I can go empty the trash, okay? And when I empty the trash, now 0 items. And as you can see, this is an old USB key, 125 megabytes available, okay? So happy day. Now, this is actually not a happy ending. Why is this not a happy ending? Sam?
So is the USB using whatever laptop you plugged into is trash?
That is exactly the problem, yes. So Sam has put his finger on it. The problem is there's only one trash. And if you look, you can actually see, if you look, in fact, at the listing of the trash, you can see that my Photos folder from the USB key is at the top of the list. So why is this sad? Why do I call this a misfit? Why does this not make me happy? Yes. Tell me your name again.
Hussein.
Hussein.
Because it's not taking up the space of the actual disk of the computer, of the USB.
That's right, but why, in terms of my own experience as a user, why am I upset about this? So it doesn't accurately represent it, but that's a rather fancy MIT kind of problem, right? I sort of agree with you. Yes, it's somehow not representing it in a nice, direct way. But what are the consequences in terms of, my miserable little life? What is it why is this making my life miserable? I mean, there are bigger miseries in life than dealing with the Macintosh trash, but why would this not make me happy?
It's hidden from you. You can't see it, the USB.
Well, you can go to the trash and you can see the item from the USB. You can actually do that. Yes, Adrian.
Doesn't fit the metaphor presented to me, where if I move something into the trash, I expect it not to be where it originally was.
If I move it into the trash, you mean you're bothered that the deletion puts it in the trash?
Or the space isn't deallocated from the USB, but it's still allocated, or it's still in the USB, but it's just showing in the trash.
But that's the same as when I move it from the drive, right? It's still using space on the drive.
When you're using your drive, it's not it doesn't matter as much
Why not?
because it's all on your computer, all your space is still there.
So I think your point's sort of the same as Hussein's, which is you're troubled by the fact that there seems to be sort of a cognitive dissonance here. Yes, I'm going to get your name. Michael.
So you can't decouple deleting things on your computer and on the drive. So in order to delete stuff on the drive, you have to delete stuff on the computer as well. Or if you want to separately delete stuff on the computer, you have to delete stuff.
Exactly. That's what's making me sad, right? So as Michael points out, I've got these two different things. I've got this USB key and I've got my whole hard drive, right? And if you're like me, if you're a super obsessive person, right, you never ever empty your trash until you have to. Why would you, right? Because maybe you'll remember there was that precious file there that you deleted 3 years ago, but you really want. So you wait until you've got less than a few gigabytes or whatever, and then you empty the trash, right? But this scenario is going to make me empty the trash and lose the ability to restore all the files on my hard disk just so that I can access this pesky little USB key. Yes?
Can't you delete individual things from the trash?
Can't you delete? So now we're getting to the solution. So there are, in fact, a bunch of bad options. And that is, in fact, one of them. You can, in fact, do what's called delete immediately. In fact, it took Apple about 30 years to implement that. It was in El Capitan, I believe. So you can do a delete immediately, right? But that's sort of not great because it's not really like the trash, right? It's a weird thing. What else could you do? Yes, Michael.
So I think what he was trying to say, or I guess what I'm saying is that aside from deleting immediately, like getting something and skipping the step of putting it in the trash, you can actually access individual files in the trash and remove them from the trash
You can. You can either delete them immediately in the original location, or you can delete them immediately in the trash. But that was a very late innovation in the trash. Actually, I believe Windows had it much earlier. They eventually did that. But it's still not really, quite what I want, right? Because it's going to, yes. Sam. Oh, so now you're actually fixing it. Maybe USBs should have their own trash folder. Well, I'll let you into a secret. It turns out they do. If you open up a Unix command line, and you look in the shell inside the USB key, /volume/USB or whatever, you'll find it has a trash folder. And so in fact, one of the common suggestions that you find on forums is, well, all you need to do is go into that folder and empty the trash manually by writing rm-rf inside that folder, right? But that's kind of interesting because it means that, that the implementation is there underneath to do what we really want. But the concept at the abstract level doesn't present that option. So in fact, there are other things you can do as well. Here's one I like. You can buy a new USB key. You can empty the trash on a different machine. You can destroy somebody else's data, right? So I go over to Megan's house and I say, Megan, I want to clean this USB key, but I don't want to lose all my files. You don't mind losing yours, do you? So I could do that. But these are all, of course, bad options. The thing I want to point out to you, and this is the interesting countercultural part of this, is that this problem is not a bug, right? Nobody filed a bug against this and said, the Macintosh trash isn't doing what it's supposed to do. It was always supposed to behave in this way. It's just that this way isn't very good. So this is the notion of a misfit, where basically you have a concept that has a behavior that doesn't quite fit the environment. In this case, it doesn't fit the fact that external drives came along and the concept wasn't extended to that. But these kinds of misfits turn out often to be much more important than simple kinds of bugs because they can be much harder to fix, and they're much harder to predict and much harder to avoid. There's one of my favorite books by a guy called Christopher Alexander addresses this problem actually in the context of architectural design, but he's been called every computer scientist's favorite architect. Because this book, which was written a long time ago, like in the 1960s, was a hit with computer scientists. And one of the reasons is he had a lot of interesting insights about design and software-related things. And what he basically says is the problem here is that if you want to rule out this kind of thing, you'd have to have an infinite set of requirements to anticipate everything that could possibly happen. And you can't do that in practice. So he says the best you can do is just figure out what's most likely to go wrong. And so how do you do that? Well, you do it from your own experience. And that's why it's important to have concept patterns, right? That when you decide you're going to use friend as a concept, you bring in everything you know from your experience of friend on Facebook, and hopefully the experience that all developers have gained about the problems with that particular concept. Another thing you can do to anticipate misfits is you can use the design heuristics, which I'm going to teach you on Wednesday. And a third thing is that you can do simulation and testing. This is what the field of design thinking is all about. It says, we don't really know how anything's going to turn out, so give it a try. Make a prototype, try it on some users, and get some nasty surprises. Okay? And that can be a very valuable thing to do. The problem is that tends to be pretty expensive, and it slows down your design exploration. And so what we'd really like to do is as much as possible in the first two categories. Okay, your second exercise is to think about this in the concept of Uber, the journey concept of Uber. So I'd like you to write down the concept, but don't worry about the whole thing, right? We'll assume we know what it's for, so we assume we know the purpose, and we'll assume that we know the structure, although the structure is actually rather complicated. But I want you to think about what are the actions and what is the operational principle, okay? But let me give you a hint, and then I want you to think about, see if you can come up with any examples of a misfit, meaning a case in which the concept of journey in Uber fails. And I don't mean because the server's down or because there's a bug in Uber. We're going to assume that everything's working as it should, right? The problem is something inherent to the concept itself. This doesn't mean it's fixable in an easy way, by the way, right? It might be the best concept for the job. Not every concept's perfect. Most concepts are not perfect. And just a hint, when you think about the operational principle, I mentioned before the span, right? You've also got to think about the fact that there might be more participants in the operational principle than first comes to mind, right? So you should also think a little bit about the driver and what actions the driver performs. But still, we're talking about something pretty tiny here. So certainly no more than 3 or 4 actions. OK? Everyone understand what I'm asking? OK, let's talk about this. So what actions do we have? Who would like to propose some actions for an Uber or Lyft journey? What are the actions? Yes. How's it pronounced?
HOUSSAM.
H-O-U, Hussam. Got it.
You can call it right. So with like a starting location to.
Excellent. And what exactly is that action doing? Is that the first action you perform?
You can get a journey essentially.
Yeah, but and what do you do when you, what is that, what's the effect of that? Sorry? Yeah, but you sure there isn't an action you perform before that, typically? What's the first thing you do when you open Uber or Lyft?
Create a user.
Sure, but after that? Put in your location, yeah. Nick? Sorry? Yeah, so there's all that stuff, that's right. You set that up. We could say that that's sort of an independent aspect of the concept. That's right. Up there, yes. Remind me of your name? Ali. No, I wouldn't do that. That's an interesting question. Would you have separate actions for each of those user interface steps? No, I wouldn't, because those are really just asking you to put in a bunch of pieces of information for a single action. So those I would not split up. That would be, and that's a good rule of thumb, right? Think about, just because something happens in multiple steps in user interface doesn't mean that it's really multiple actions. In exactly the same way that when you've designed a node application, right, you can do multiple things in the interface before there's actually an HTTP request that actually updates the database. Jackson. Exactly. So you really start by getting a quote, right? The first thing you do in most of these applications is you say, give me a quote. Tell me how much you would charge me to take me, from 32 Vassar Street to 77 Mass Ave, right? And Uber comes back and says, I would charge you, I'd charge you $5 or whatever. Megan.
What's the difference than putting a destination and then getting a quote? Like, you just kind of couple the action.
Well, I'm just saying that putting in a destination doesn't actually have any effect, right? The first thing you're actually, in terms of what you're trying to get out of the app, the first thing you're trying to do functionally is get a quote. So you put in some bunch of information, essentially where you are now, where you want to go, and then it gives you quotes, typically for different kinds of services. UberX will cost you this, and so on, right? OK, so the first step is you do a quote. What's the next step? So I guess we're doing the operational principle now. Yes, Costa. Yeah, basically you confirm. And at that point, you're committed, right, essentially? Yeah, you can cancel. I think if you don't do anything, it essentially cancels, right? But at that point, you're actually saying, I am now basically accepting this quote, meaning that if a car turns up, it will take me to my destination. OK, so that's step 2. What's step 3? Yes? You could edit your journey. So let's talk about the operational principle, which is just the archetypal scenario. So you're right, there are lots of tricky things you can do, but I want to stick to the simple case. Sam? Yeah, exactly. The driver, right, some driver has to accept that journey, right? So the drivers in the area all get a notification saying, Adrian wants to go 100 yards down the road, and they get to decide whether or not they want to do that. And if one of them says yes, then it says, Daniel is coming to pick you up. OK, and what's next? Well, now it's easy, right? Darius? Yeah, the driver turns up. Maybe we'll break into 2 actions, pick up and arrival at destination. OK, so actually it's quite a complex operational principle, right? It has all these different steps in it. And to use Uber, you need to understand all these steps. What's an example of a misfit? Why doesn't this always necessarily work? Yes, Darius?
If you don't know where you want to go.
If you don't, that's a good point. If you don't know where you want to go, you just want to take a nice, pleasure ride, it's not going to work very well. So maybe we'd have to change the purpose if we wanted, to say, to take you to particular destinations. Don't tell me. Jonathan.
If you want to change destination, I believe you have to get to the place first and then.
Oh, interesting. So changing destinations is awkward. That's right. You're making it, the fact that you have to make an early commitment, which you don't have to do in a taxi. What else can go wrong? Michael.
Get in the car and cancel the ride, and then be driven there.
Wait, you get in the car and you cancel the ride because?
The driver doesn't notice that you canceled the ride, so they continue the route, and then you're.
Oh, is that true?
That could be the case.
Yeah, I guess that could be the case. I would have thought that would be a little strange if you canceled it without telling the driver. But yeah, it's an interesting one. Yes, Jackson. Yeah, no driver actually wants to take you. That's a potential problem, right? Does that ever happen? Yeah, it's happened to me. So the particular, yeah, they don't actually, Megan's laughing, but they don't know me, so it's okay. Or maybe they don't know me. Maybe they have this thing, the black thing that comes up. That's Daniel Jackson, don't give him a ride. No, but here's one common scenario where I'm convinced that they don't do it. When they are about to hit surge pricing, right, often what happens is they quote prior to surge pricing, and then surge pricing comes, right? So now, if the driver now accepts a ride, a new ride, they will make more money than they would have made for the same journey on the ride that they're about to commit to, right? So actually, what this causes a lot of drivers to do, at least in my experience, is to cancel the ride that they've already confirmed, right? Because you accept the ride thinking, yeah, I'll do this ride for $10, and then you suddenly realize there's a better option, either to do a surge, or maybe you see something come up for someone who wants to be taken to the airport for more money, right? So the fact that the driver can cancel the ride after you've confirmed it is very annoying. Any other ones you can think of? Yes, Jackson. Yeah, exactly. The quote actually is often not that accurate. So that's a problem, which is that the quote you get doesn't actually correspond to the price you pay. So anyway, these are all interesting things, and they can all be pursued purely in terms of the abstract concept. You don't need to ask anything about the implementation, whether or not you have good connectivity, whether or not you have bugs in your code, right? These are all questions about whether or not this particular pattern of actions and structure actually works, right? And notice that, that there are a lot of assumptions here. For example, there's nothing that lets notice that the Uber driver just gets to accept or reject a particular bid, right? They don't get to say, well, I'd like to hang on, see what all my options are, and maybe choose the best one, right? It's just like, here's an option. Do you want to accept it or not? And similarly, you, as a customer, you don't get to say, well, there are 5 cars in the area, and they're all making different bids for me, and I'd like to take this one. I'd rather go in the Mercedes-Benz than the Honda, right? You don't get to do that. Now, probably it's a good idea that you don't get to do that, because if you did, it would make the concept design very complicated, and then there would probably be other problems in terms of ease of use, okay? But nevertheless, the concept has some misfits. So, in summary, concepts really bring together just a bunch of familiar ideas, right? You've really seen all these things before. You've seen certainly structure in terms of data models. You've seen behavior before this class. The idea, maybe not this idea of describing the behavior of a system in terms of actions on a data model, but that's a very common idea in computer science. The idea, of course, of having a purpose, and the idea of a sample scenario. But what makes concepts interesting is that they put these together and they focus on these relatively simple things and get you thinking about what they really are and how they interact with each other. And they also give you a useful decomposition, because now when you think about an app, you don't think about the entire app's behavior. Instead, you can think about all the concepts you're going to have in the app. And one reason that's very helpful is, like when you're doing your final project, you can say, well, let's just throw in friending, right? That would be useful for this app. Or let's throw in the notion of out-of-band authentication. Or let's throw in the notion of upvotes, right? And the point is that when you introduce these concepts, they come as known things. So they're very easy to use because the hard work has been done, right? And so these are a way to think about reuse and what you can borrow. But I hope that what you will also come away with is that when you actually focus on these essential aspects of design, things actually get pretty hard. And they don't get hard. I hope you're not thinking they get hard because any of these notions is itself hard and awkward, right? They're hard because the business of design is hard. And so all these are making you do is focus very clearly on what you're really trying to design and why you're trying to design it. So next time, we're going to start with what I think is probably the only comedy skit I know on the subject of conceptual design. And then we will talk about design criteria and how to evaluate concepts and make them better. So see you on Wednesday.